And there's still a lot of neuroscientists believe that you have to look in the brain to find it. And until now, they did not find it. They will never find it as well. But the problem is for most neuroscientists, the philosophers as well, psychologists sometimes as well, that they have the research money. And when you say it's not in the brain, but somewhere else, they lose the research money, they lose the position on the university. Okay. So they're frightened. And I know some professors who just tell me personally, I agree with what you tell, but officially they say it's total nonsense until they retire.
Okay.
And then they're open, and then they say, yes, it is different as I have told before.
Welcome to another episode of Mind the Shift. My name is Anders Bolling. What are we? We cover a wide range of topics to understand the shifts going on in our integrating humanity here on the podcast. But it's difficult not to constantly return to the question of what a human being really is, essentially. We know we have bodies, and science, Western science at least, seems to be to understand quite a bit of how those function. But what about the non-physical aspects of us? Sometimes it feels as if we, at least we in the West, are on a kindergarten level when it comes to understanding the less palpable sides of humans. One of the most astonishing subjective experiences a person can have, an experience which also seems to unveil some of those non-physical aspects, is what we call a near-death experience, an NDE. We have had NDEers here on the podcast, like Eben Alexander and Ingrid Honkola. And today, I am honored and delighted to introduce you to one of the world's leading researchers in the field of NDE studies, cardiologist Pim van Lommel. Welcome to Mind the Shift.
You're welcome.
So you were, as far as I understand, the first scientist to bring the study of NDEs to the area of hospital medicine. You initiated a huge prospective study in the Netherlands in 1988, and 13 years later, you published the results in the scientific paper of The Lancet, and it was immensely very much noticed. And you have since published several scientific papers on the topic, and you brought also your findings into a book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which was published in its first edition in 2007 and was also very much noticed. Your research and your book raise, of course, an unlimited amount of questions. I would like to know in our conversation here today about the science, of course, and about the borderline between science and spirituality, and about the reception of in the scientific community, and also your personal journey. But I'll try to be stringent as well as open to where the conversation leads us. Maybe it's pertinent to begin simply with the concrete research and what you have found. Could you first please give the audience a brief definition of a near-death experience? What are the common features?
Yes, a near-death experience is the reported memory of a special state of consciousness with universal elements like experience of being out of the body, awareness of being out of the body, eternal experience, meeting a light or a being of light, meeting deceased relatives, a life review, sometimes a flash forward, coming to a border, and then the conscious return back into the body. These are the universal elements. And what is striking is so when the body doesn't function anymore, like cardiac arrest, you have cognition, memories, whatever, your feelings, etc. The non-functioning brain, and that's a challenge for science as well.
So, how common are they? You say we're talking about people with cardiac arrests.
Yeah.
So how common is it that
we know from inquiries in Germany and USA, about 4.2% of the general population will have had a near-death experience. So that means 20 million people in Europe and 9 million people in the USA. And we know it especially from the Western world. We don't know how many times it occurs in other countries, but we know it will occur in other countries and other cultures. That has been mentioned in all times, in all cultures, in all religions in the past as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get back to that, the notion that these experiences have been talked about since ancient times.
Yes.
So these people, they have these experiences of, like you say, going to a different realm that they perceive as more real than this physical reality. They often meet dead, deceased relatives. They have, sometimes they go through a tunnel and reach some kind of light, which feels, and they feel all surrounded by unconditional love, as far as I understand. And so how does it differ from other similar experiences that people have, like hallucinations and dreams, vivid dreams, for instance? What's the difference?
Well, the near-death experience is such an overwhelming experience with an overwhelming content that you will never forget it, and it changed your whole life, because it has also transformational aspects. When you have this kind of experience, you change your insight in death. So they don't believe in death anymore. Death is not the end of who we are. They have a new insight of what is important in life, and usually they also have enhanced intuitive sensitivities. So they change really impressively. And after a hallucination or a dream, you forget a dream. Usually, sometimes people can remember dreams. And hallucination has nothing to do with reality at all.
That's true. That's why it's called hallucination.
Yeah, and hallucination also occurs when the brain is still functioning, and in cardiac arrest, it doesn't function at all.
Oh yeah, that's the crux. That's the main thing and feature about this.
Yeah.
And there are, of course, skeptics still, despite the fact that this has been described since thousands of years, and despite the fact that, I'll come back to that, I think many also very famous scientists of all kinds of areas have described this notion that consciousness is not located in the brain. It still is a very controversial concept, and there are a lot of skeptics. You have in your research examined the many alternative explanations for NDEs that have been presented, and as we mentioned, hallucinations, and many still think they are hallucinations, but you explain that they aren't. But there are, for instance, explanations like physical ones, like the lack of oxygen and increased levels of CO2, etc. Can you talk a little bit about those explanations?
Well, these discussions were the start of our study. So I was raised in a medical school and university that consciousness is a product of brain function. So it should be impossible that people can have enhanced consciousness with memories, with the possibility of perception out and above the body during cardiac arrest. So, and the first time I ever heard a patient with telling an NDE without knowing that these kind of experiences existed was in 1969. One of the first coronary care units in the Netherlands. I was just starting my training as cardiologist. And in the second coronary care unit in Holland, we had a patient of 43 years old who had a cardiac arrest, and we resuscitated him with defibrillation and external chest compression. And he regained consciousness after 4 minutes, and we were so happy. It was the first time for me as a physician that we succeeded to get someone back. But the patient was extremely disappointed. Now going through a tunnel, seeing a light, seeing wonderful landscapes, etc. I never forgot this. And we don't remember or realize anymore that the modern techniques of resuscitation, CPR, is only possible since 67, 68. So before 67, all patients died with cardiac arrest. So since the modern techniques of resuscitation, we have the possibility to talk to patients who survive a cardiac arrest. I mean, I didn't know anything about near-death experience. So until I read a book in 1986 by George Ritchie, Returned from Tomorrow, who as a medical student in 43 died from liver pneumonia, and there were no antibiotics available. And he had a very extensive near-death experience in a period of 9 minutes of death. He was resuscitated because his body was already covered with a sheet, and the nurse was so upset that this medical student had died that he persuaded the doctor to give him an injection of adrenaline right into his heart, which was quite uncommon at that time, and he regained consciousness. He had a very deep and extensive NDE. When I've read this book in 86, I just started out of curiosity to ask patients who had survived a cardiac arrest if he had memories from this period of unconsciousness. And to my big surprise, within 2 years, out of 50 patients I asked this question, 12 patients told me about the NDE. That was the moment my scientific curiosity started to grow, because it was impossible, according to current medical science, that people could have these kind of experiences. So until that time, 88, there had been just retrospective studies done with a huge selection of patients, and you never know exactly what happens medically after 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So in that time, the theory was it was just lack of oxygen in the brain, neurotransmitters, hallucinations, bad dreams, trying to be very interesting, etc. So then we started our study in 88 with a prospective study of 344 consecutive patients who were survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals. And then we did a second study of longitudinal study with late interviews 2 years and 8 years after the cardiac arrest with all patients who survived with an NDE, and then a matched control group of patients who survived the cardiac arrest without any memories, to see if the transformation, what I told you before, was a result of cardiac arrest or a result of the NDE that was never studied before in the prospective design. Now, what we found in our prospective study, the 344 patients, is that there was no explanation at all why patients should report a near-death experience. So the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, didn't matter at all. So the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, didn't matter at all. Complicated CPR with the artificial respiration didn't matter at all. In the cardiac catheter with electrophysiological studies, we have sometimes to induce cardiac arrest in patients that we resuscitated within 20 to 30 seconds. Didn't matter at all. So the severity of anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, was not an explanation at all why patients reported NDE. And it was the same with the given medication. The same with psychological explanations or fear of death before the arrest. No religion, if they were atheist or Christian, didn't matter at all. Education, gender, didn't matter at all. So to our surprise, we found that there was no medical explanation, and we could exclude lack of oxygen in the brain as an explanation about cause and content of the NDE.
And heightened levels of CO2 is the same with that, or
same with that too. Yeah. So when you have cardiac arrest, the oxygen level is lower and the CO2 is higher than normal. That is not an explanation at all. So we could exclude all the medical, physiological, etc. explanations.
But often or always when people have had these experiences, their EEG, to the extent that those have been measured, has flatlined. Is that correct?
So what of course, the challenge is to know what happens in the brain and in the body when you have cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
So there have been studies done in induced cardiac arrest, let's say from patients who have an ICD, an internal defibrillator, to measure the threshold testing. And they did it with EEG registration, so the registration of the electrical activity of the cortex of the brain. Now what we see when you measure the blood flow of the carotid artery in cardiac arrest, the blood flow is zero without 1 to 2 seconds. The people lose consciousness within several seconds, 2, 3, 4 seconds. There are no body reflexes left, so the body is totally without any reflexes, which is a function of the cortex. The brainstem reflexes are done. The gag reflex, you can put a finger in someone's throat. Whitened pupils who don't react to light or corneal reflex are gone. And the breathing.
So basically, they're in a coma. Is that what you call it?
In coma, you can have sometimes even brainstem reflexes, but in cardiac arrest, there are no brainstem reflexes left.
Okay.
And then you have the breathing center close to the brainstem, which stops functioning. So people have apnea; they don't breathe anymore. And when you measure the EEG activity in all patients within 10 to 20 seconds, there is a flatline EEG. So all patients in our study must have had a flatline EEG because no patient will ever be resuscitated successfully within 20 seconds. It usually takes 1, 2, 4, 5 minutes, and an out of hospital arrest much more. So the mortality rate in patients in out of hospital arrest is about 90%. So when you don't initiate CPR within 5 to 10 minutes, all patients will die due to irreversible damage to the brain. So it's called clinical death. It's the first stage of the process of dying. And these patients we studied in our Dutch prospective design.
So flatline EEG is for a layman something that indicates that there is something else going on here than brain activity. Of course, when people experience these things. Can we also talk a little bit about the fact that these people have heard and seen things in the room, for instance, where they have been resuscitated, which has been corroborated by personnel in the room afterwards? Because that's, I think, sometimes important for skeptics to hear, in order for them to maybe change their minds about it, because otherwise they can always say, oh, that's just a figment of imagination. But there are some concrete things here. Can you?
It's very important. Your question is very important. That was for us very important as well. So there's a study chapter written by Jane Holden in the book Yearbook of Near-Death Experience, and also recently a book The Soul Does Not Die. With in a total more than 200 cases from critical perception that had been corroborated by doctors, nurses, and family members. And also in our study, we described also one very intriguing out-of-body experience of a patient. We published it in the Lancet article as well. It is also in my book.
Yeah.
From a 44-year-old man who was brought into coronary care unit, who was found in coma in a meadow, and the people didn't start to do CPR really. So when he was brought into hospital by the ambulance, they were doing external chest compression, and in the ambulance they had tried several times to defibrillate him without any success. So when he was brought into hospital, the coronary care, his body was cold, already blue, no circulation, no breathing. His pupils were white, not reaction to light. And the first thing the nurse wanted to do is to give him artificial respiration, so to intubate the patient, to put something in his throat to give him more oxygen. They found out that this patient had a dentures in his mouth, so the nurse removed his upper denture and put it somewhere under in the crash cart. And this patient needed 1.5 hours, which is quite long, before he had circulation, blood pressure again. But because he was young, they really did a good try. But he was still in coma. He still needed artificial respiration. So he was transferred to the intensive care unit to continue artificial respiration for 1 week. He was 1 week in coma. Then he was brought back to the coronary care. He was just there, and the nurse came in for medication. He saw the nurse and said, "You know where my dentures are." And he told the nurse that he had taken out his dentures and put it in a sliding underneath of in the crash cart. He could describe the appearance of all the nurses and the doctors who were busy with the CPR. He could describe the resuscitation room from above, where he was brought into coma, where he was transferred to the intensive care room in coma. And he could describe it into detail. So this proved that what he described as a perception out and above his body was corroborated by the nurse, by doctors, etc. And it seemed to be true. So but skeptics always say this is an anecdote. But we have so many stories of this critical perceptions that there's no other explanation for this kind of perception.
There have sometimes been placed symbols close to the ceiling on top of lamps and things in operation room in order to see if these patients that are in coma can afterwards describe what's but they seldom look at those symbols.
Well, we had two resuscitation rooms in our study as well with hidden signs above the operation lamp.
Yeah.
And other studies have done also by Penny Sartori in the UK, and also still Sampani is doing it in the US. And until now, there has no patient have ever seen this hidden sign somewhere close to the ceiling. And there is an explanation for it. When you perceive, also when we are awake, we only perceive when we have intention and attention. When you drive a car and you look at your iPhone, there are so many accidents now because you cannot do two things at the same moment. It's called unintentional blindness. There are also studies done, and I refer to it in my book as well. So when you are out of your body, you see your own resuscitation, you see that it's your own body there, where you're looking fine at close to the ceiling. You don't start to look around if there could be somewhere a hidden sign. That's my explanation.
No, because it's not important for that person, for that person's life. Or
they're
anything.
Not interested at all to look around, but they're so surprised they see their own resuscitation or their own operation.
Of course, I would be very surprised myself. I wouldn't be looking for hidden symbols.
And then the perception is totally different from the eyes. So you have a 360 degrees perception, and you can see details and overview at the same moment as well. And also from a position out and above the body, you can see a perception in another part of the hospital, or you can be, when you think of your home, you will be at your home at the same time and see your family members waiting there. So it's not just in the room where you are resuscitated. We can have sometimes a perception from away from where your resuscitation takes place.
Yeah. Then some skeptics say also that, flatline EEG doesn't rule out brain activity, but you write somewhere in the book, I think, that them saying this misses the point.
Exactly.
So how can you explain what you mean by that?
Or to experience waking experience, it's the consciousness we have now when we talk to each other, you have a lot of activity in many neural centers who have communication with each other and integration of information. So you have a network of neuronal networks who work together. And there's not any sign of this global network activity at all during cardiac arrest. So according to our current neuroscience, it should be impossible to have any consciousness at all. So it's not, and we have had, there have been studies done in animals, and also the deep structures of the brain didn't function at all anymore in cardiac arrest in animals.
Yeah. And I mean, you could also philosophically ponder the fact that, I mean, you and I are talking now, but how can we be, who is it, what is it that tells me that I'm going to use these words when I talk to you exactly now in this moment? I mean, I can see the brain activity resulting from me speaking to you, but what's the hen and what's the egg, so to speak? Well, we'll come back to that.
Perhaps can I add something that blind people, blind from birth, can have theoretical perception out and above the body during near-death experiences. There have been written a book by
Yeah, they have been able to quote unquote see things during these experiences.
And they have never seen anything, and people who are blind from birth don't have any pictures when they dream. They don't know anything about pictures, about how it is to see. And then during NDE, they see themselves, or they see landscapes, etc., they've never seen in their whole life.
They must be enormously transformative.
No, it is totally transformative. Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a good example. But there are still so many skeptics out there, which is a bit frustrating. I checked your Wikipedia page. Maybe you have looked at it, and it only refers, the references to your book is only from skeptical people. You know, it's only referring the skeptical reviews. It's really unfair. There is a debate going. There's a discussion on the article, which you can access. Maybe you have done that, and they are a little bit more. They are critical to how it's been written, but still, it's really unfair because it has no use.
It has no use to change your Wikipedia page, because when you want to change it, you change it again within one day. The skeptics are very active.
They're active.
So I don't look at it at all, and it is not fair at all. It's
No,
just,
don't do it.
They're frightened. They're frightened because they lose the worldview when it should be right, when it should be really happening like will the people with an NDE tell us. Then the whole worldview collapses. So they're frightened, and they're very aggressive as well. They attack the person. They put it ad hominem. It's not a scientific discussion. They attack me as a person as well, or they attack Eben Alexander as a person as well. That's how it is.
Yeah, sometimes I get the impression, maybe you do it too, that the skeptic's main argument is that this can't be, because such a thing can't be. I mean, it's a catch-22 argument in a way. So it can never be like this, and thus the task is to find a physical explanation at any cost, as it were. And we will just have to accept that the phenomena we can't yet explain with physics, they are inexplicable for the time being. So we just have to wait. That's the only way they look at it. Do you see it the same way? Do you have the same experience?
The current science has the Western science had the materialist paradigm, which is that only what we can measure, what we can objectify, what you can duplicate, what you can falsify is reality.
Yeah.
So that's the physical aspects of everything we see and measure. But consciousness and the content of consciousness, what we feel and what we think, we cannot objectify, we cannot measure, we cannot duplicate, we cannot falsify. So it is beyond our current materialist paradigm in science. Everything from consciousness. So consciousness studies of the last 10, 50 years are changing the concept and the definition of science as well. So we need what we call a post-materialist science, or an all-inclusive science, which includes subjective experiences as real as well. What we feel and think is our essence.
It is. It's at the core of all knowledge, actually.
Exactly. And there's still a lot of neuroscientists believe that you have to look in the brain to find it. And until now, they did not find it. They will never find it as well. But the problem is, for the most neuroscientists, the philosophers as well, psychologists sometimes as well, that they have the research money. And when you say it's not in the brain, but somewhere else, they lose the research money, they lose the position in the university. Okay. So they're frightened. And I know some professors who just tell me personally, I agree with what you tell, but officially they say it's total nonsense until they retire.
Okay.
And then they're open, and then they say, yes, it is different as I've told before.
Yes, but you were brave then, because you started pondering this already in 1969. But it was not until you read that book in 1986 that you started to really want to look deeper into it, or had you been thinking about this ever since that experience in 1969?
It was just my scientific curiosity after reading the book by George Ritchie. It started to help me to start this research.
Okay. So what about now? It's been 20 years since you, if we continue on that, the way skeptics look at it and science, mainstream science, it's been 20 years since you published that paper in the Lancet. Have you noticed any kind of shift in the scientific community towards this? The NDE studies and the notion that consciousness is perhaps not located in the brain?
Yeah. Well, there have been 4 studies done, prospective design studies based on the same design as our study, like one study in the USA by Bruce Grayson, and 2 British studies, one by Sampani Peter Fennick, another one by Paddy Sartori, with a total of 562 survivors of cardiac arrest. And in these 4 studies, we all found that there was no physiological, psychological, or medical explanation why people have this kind of experiences. And they all found the same percentage of NDE between 10 and 20% of the patients who survive a cardiac arrest report this kind of NDEs. So it's still the paradoxical occurrence of enhanced consciousness when the brain does not function at all. And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
And then the philosophical question of where consciousness is located. I know David Chalmers, you refer to him in the book quite a lot, and he's famous for coining this expression, the hard problem of consciousness, which is it's a good term actually, because it's really a hard problem. Most of the knowledge, the things that we don't know about the world are easy problems because we can understand how we someday will be able to understand it. But we will probably never be able to, by way of traditional science, understand how we understand things, so to speak. I mean, the core of, as we were talking about before.
So what we can measure is neural correlates of consciousness. You see changing in activation when you see or think or whatever you do, but you cannot measure consciousness itself. You can just changing neural correlates. And neural correlates, it's not the same as consciousness.
No.
So I sometimes compare it with the gravity. We can measure the effect of gravity on Earth, but we cannot measure gravity forces at all because it is in a higher dimension. It's not in the physical reality.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, it's true. It's really an enigma.
Yeah.
I mean, I think laymen think that we can measure gravity, but we can't.
Okay. No.
It's nothing that can be seen.
You can see the physical effects of gravity.
Yes.
The physical effects of consciousness. We cannot measure it itself. So for me, the brain has a facilitating function and not a producing function of consciousness. So it makes it possible to experience waking consciousness in your body and in your brain, but it doesn't produce it. And to understand this, I compared with the worldwide net, with the internet, with 1 billion websites or 1 billion YouTube films. You need a functioning computer to receive some parts of this websites, of the part of the iCloud. But it is not produced by your computer.
Mm.
When you put off your computer, the internet is still there. When you put off your brain, your consciousness is still there. It's everywhere. So it's non-local. It's beyond time and beyond space. It is what we know from the live review and also sometimes with flash forward. You can connect with what you have done in the past, what you have thought in the past. Each thought you ever had is kept alive. And you can also have sometimes see future events as well. So you are in a dimension, in a realm, where time and space do not play any role anymore. And that's the non-local realm. And that's why we call it non-local consciousness. Beyond time and beyond space, which is different. So the waking consciousness is just a part of this non-local consciousness.
Yeah. Well, you use the analogy of a computer there, and I just love that. I've been using the analogy of a TV set, but but it's a bit incomplete. So you use also in the book the analogy of a transceiver, which is a device that record and transmits.
So it is the television camera and the television set together.
Yeah.
Television camera makes the physical realm, fixes into information, and then the electromagnetic information, and the TV set makes electromagnetic information back into sound and view.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And when I heard it the first time, I think it was in the late 80s or so, or maybe earlier. I can't remember if it was Rupert Sheldrake or somebody talking about morphic resonance and morphic fields,
yes.
Which is a little bit the same concept. It immediately made sense to me, because then you can understand why people. I mean, you can remove big parts of the brain, and some people who suffers that, are subject to that. They can still function more or less normally, and it's inexplicable if you don't understand that the brain is something different than where everything emanates from. And it's also plastic. There's also this what you call neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
Yes, and you have this wonderful sentence also in your book where you write, how can a product, I can't remember exactly what it is now, but how can a product change its producer or something like that?
Exactly. That's it.
Which is really, really good.
Yeah. So neuroplasticity, we know that when we, in a daily life, our brain changes as well. As long as we think and study, our brain changes as well. And when we make music, our brain changes as well. But we also know that by, let's say, the placebo effect, where you think that you receive a medication. And it is especially studied in chronic pain patients or in severe depression or in Parkinson's disease. When you give them placebo, you see changes in the brain that are identical with the real medication. So you self-changes your brain because you believe that you receive this information, this medication. And that's the same with permanent and temporary changes in the brain by meditation. When people meditate, you see permanent changes in the brain as well. So you get structural and functional changes in the brain by meditation, by placebo effect, and also by mindfulness. So you can prove that these changes are real.
So how would a skeptic explain a thing like that? That the placebo effect actually changes the neurons in the brain?
I don't know. I don't know how they can explain it.
Probably not.
No.
Now, well, this is with the general idea of consciousness not being located in the brain, but I think some people may have heard of that, not least because of this debate around what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. But I think it's a bit more surprising to the layman that mainstream science has also not been able to locate where memories are stored in the brain. It's a bit more surprising, but it's the same thing there, is it?
Yes, you have some memories when you're awake. But when you're out of your body during cardiac arrest, you have memories from birth. And you know exactly what happens, what you thought, what you have said, what you have done. And you also in life review are connected with the consciousness of others as well. So when you took some plaything from your little sister, you know how sad she was. You know how sad. So you're connected with the consciousness of others as well. So in this other realm, non-local realm, you're connected with the consciousness of others as well, which is totally different from some memories we have in our body when we are awake. So there are many more memories that are available when you are awake.
This is a little bit analogous to what spiritual people call the Akashic Records. You're familiar with those?
Yes.
The concept that every knowledge is somewhere in that non-physical realm, and we can access it under certain circumstances.
So in the Hindus call it Akashic Records. Irvin Laszlo calls it the Akashic Records. Rudolf Steiner calls it Akashic Records.
Yeah.
Teilhard de Chardin calls it noosphere. But it is what we call now the non-local realm. Everything is stored there, and we are available to have access to this. And when we have had this near-death experience, the access to this non-local realm has been enhanced. So you don't just receive channel 1, your own consciousness, but you receive channel 2, 3, and 4, consciousness of others as well. So you know what other people think and feel, which is quite amazing and frightening as well. You see someone and know that he will die in 3 weeks, and he will die in 3 weeks. So you don't want it, but they have this access to non-local consciousness, and it's frightening for them. And they usually don't talk about it. You have to ask about it as well. So their whole life change, and they have a lot of what we call non-local information exchange. They will receive information not by the senses and not by the body, which is really frightening. It's totally unexpected as well.
Yeah. So what about these people, the majority of people who have suffered cardiac arrest who do not experience an NDE? Where are their consciousnesses when they are gone?
Well, the question first is, those 82% of the people who don't report an NDE, they don't have an NDE, or do they not remember an NDE? That's the first question. Now, we know from very young patients who have an NDE under the age of 5 or 6, you usually don't remember the NDE, but they all have the transformation, especially enhanced intuitive sensitivity. So you don't have to remember it, but you have the transformation. Now, that was one of the reasons we did the prospective study with 8 interviews, 2 years and 8 years, to see if there is a transformational aspect in people having a cardiac arrest without reporting an NDE. And we found a statistical difference. So only patients with an NDE have this transformation, which for me proves that these patients who don't report it did not have it. Now, there are some other aspects as well. our mean age in our study, cardiac arrest patients, was 62 years old. Patients under the age of 60 had more often an NDE than the older part of the study. People who had an NDE as a child of a younger age had more often an NDE as well. And we know from retrospective studies that with a mean age between 30 and 40, usually car accidents, whatever, there's a percentage of 30 to 40% NDE. And when there's only one study with prospective study done in young children, the percentage is 70% NDE. So the younger you are, the more chance you have with an NDE. And it means for me that when you are young, the connection between consciousness and the brain is more loose. And the older you are, the connection is more strict. So when you have a cardiac arrest at the age of 60 or 70, it takes more time to get out of your body. And you resuscitate within 5 to 10 minutes. And the old people who die will have a death experience, but perhaps it takes 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours before they're out of the body. And in our study, you have been resuscitated within 5 to 10 minutes. So they didn't have the chance to get out of the body. That's my explanation. It's a speculation, but I think that could be an explanation. But it is speculation.
Children are very interesting, very young children, especially under the age of 6 or 7, where it seems as if the brain starts to become more like the brain of adults. You know that at the University of Virginia, they're conducting studies on past life memories and really meticulously studying stories, narratives from young children who talk about memories from past lives or what seems to be past lives, and they have checked sometimes if these stories can be right, and they have been able to corroborate many of the details.
No.
Have you also looked into this thing about past life memories, or what we would call reincarnation?
No, I didn't look at it, but I know the studies from Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker as well. And especially also before the age of 6, they have spontaneous memories because they are more open, they are more connected with the non-local consciousness. And when they are getting 6 or 7, then the new worldview comes and you forget your past, your connection with the non-local consciousness are getting lost. It's getting lost. So, but I know there have been studies done where 90% of all the things young children told happened to be true when you go to other families where he would have lived, etc. So I think it's real. Reincarnation is a real possibility. But Ian Stevenson has said there's no scientific proof for reincarnation that is beyond reasonable doubt. And that's the same for near-death experience. You cannot prove it because you cannot prove scientifically subjective experiences, but it is beyond reasonable doubt. It happens so many times. You cannot say it's nothing. You cannot say it's nonsense.
No, but if you have all these stories, detailed stories, and you can corroborate that they are actually, I mean, it goes beyond random after a while, of course.
Exactly.
So, and I personally, I've thought a little bit about how small children. I thought about it just the other day. Small children react and how they behave is really fairly odd, actually. If we were to be randomly assembled flesh robots, so to speak, biological robots, we would be more or less, tabula rasa, blank slate when we are born, apart from some, of course, genetic inheritance. But other than that, we would be completely, open to whatever is happening here on Earth. But small children are really acting in a peculiar way because they're really, truly surprised when they can't have the things that they desire immediately. Firstly, that they can't have them because it's not yours. You can't have it because it's not yours, and you can't have it now. And they're you can look at them, you can see that they're truly, truly surprised, and then they're sad, and then they're angry. And we find it funny. But if you think about it more deeply, it's really very strange that they would react in that way if they didn't have some kind of remembrance of another reality, another realm where these things were natural. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I totally agree.
So the question I asked about where people without memories of an NDE are, or where their consciousness is when they are out is basically the same question as where are we? Where is our consciousness when we are in deep sleep? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, the REM sleep is the sleep where we have dreams, I guess, and then you can see brain activity and all that, and you can remember dreams many times. But then we are in deep sleep. Where are we then? What do you think?
Well, there's still activity in the brain,
Okay,
but you're not.
but we can't remember what we're doing.
No, because there is no waking consciousness. So we need other activity in the brain to have waking consciousness. That's also in general anesthesia. There's activity in the brain that you don't experience waking consciousness. Because you need a special activity in the brain, what I've told you before, with the several neural centers who communicate with each other and have information exchange. And this exchange stops during sleep and stops during general anesthesia. So I always ask when I lecture to the audience, where is your conscious when you're asleep? Because you have conscious, but you don't experience it because your brain doesn't receive this information. And when you dream, we have also a different kind of consciousness. It's also beyond time and space. Sometimes you have prognostic dreams that you dream about something and years later you say, oh, that's what I have dreamt, a funeral, a wedding, a house somewhere in another country. You say, oh, I've been there before. You please. So you can have prognostic dreams as well.
Yeah.
So you can have access to this other realm during dreams. You have lucid dreams as well, that you're aware that you're dreaming. You can change the content of your dreams as well. So
yeah, I've heard about that. I haven't experienced that myself, as far as I remember. But
do you remember your dreams?
Yes, I do. Most mornings, I remember the last dreams I had, or I wake up a couple of times during the night.
I never remember.
No. You never?
No, never. But I think you can train a little bit, but I never had it. No.
Yeah. I've had what some people call big dreams a few times during my life, maybe 10 or so, and I've written them down, so I have them in a file.
Okay.
And they were really big because I woke up without any obvious objective reason for waking up. It was completely quiet. I just woke up like my higher self or whatever it is told me that you have to remember this. This is important. It was a feeling like that.
So that's a kind of lucid dreaming. Yeah, that's a kind of lucid dreaming.
Maybe it is.
The aspect of yourself said you have to wake up and remember it. So there are two aspects of consciousness at the same time.
Yeah, I didn't hear a voice telling me that, but I had a feeling, an inkling. Yeah.
It doesn't to be a voice, but it is an inner knowing.
Yeah, it was like that. Yeah. It's many years now since I had that, but during my formative years, I guess. So, okay, so this is also a little bit going into the societal matter of side of things here. This notion about consciousness and what it is. There is a number of well-known scientists, as we mentioned earlier, psychologists, of course, but also physicists, philosophers, and other scientists that and since over 100 years ago that have had this general idea that consciousness is not in the brain and it's also central to existence. I can just mention a few, and you mentioned many of them in your book: William James, Albert Einstein, Erwin Schrödinger, John Wheeler, Greg Matloff, Roger Penrose, David Chalmers, we mentioned, and more recently, Donald Hoffman, Nassim Haramein, Bruce Lipton, and others. Only men, by the way. It's just a coincidence, but anyway, and these. So it's not a new concept. Well, if consciousness is indeed central to existence, and it's, so to say, precedes the material existence, matter is a consequence of consciousness rather than the other way around, then does that entail that reality is more or less subjective to the extent that there is an objective reality? This is perhaps more some kind of a lowest common denominator, so to speak, for all the myriad subjective perceptions that we have of reality. Would you?
So what we call it is the consciousness is fundamental in the universe. So everything what we experience is based on our state of consciousness. So when we are in love, the world is beautiful. When you're depressed, the world is awful. When you're terrified by the press or by the politicians, the world is frightening. So everything is subjective. And we also know it from quantum physics that there is no objective science at all. So the results of an experiment, like the double slit experiment, is depending of the consciousness of the scientist. The design of the experiments makes the result of what we will find. So we can prove that light behaves as particles, and we can prove that light behaves as waves. Both is true, but it is impossible that both is true. So it's how we look at an experiment, what our design is, makes the result as well. So it's subjective.
Mm. But does that tell us something about how we should look at this whole debate about, political and societal debate about truth and deniers, fact resistance? Maybe that's taking it a bit far, but to some extent it might have something to do with it.
Well, I think fake news is awful, and also about climate change and about what happened to the earth is how we have to change ourselves to change the world. We cannot change other people. We have to change our own consciousness and the way we perceive the world. Then we can change ourselves, and by changing ourselves, we can change the world as well. So we have to listen to people with an NE who say that everything and everybody is always connected. So what we do to others will come back to us in positive and negative ways. What we do to nature, to planet Earth,
we do to ourselves,
will come back to ourselves. So when we know that everything is connected, we have to change the way we live to save the communities and to save our planet Earth as well. And because there is also that everything is always connected.
Yes. And ancient texts reveal a lot of knowledge about these things, about the afterlife, of course. And this is a knowledge that we obviously now are again becoming aware of, thanks to the increased possibility to resuscitate dying patients. But we tend to perceive ancient beliefs and ancient texts and ancient thoughts as too simple, too fairy tale-like, and we also have been taught that the lives of ancient people was miserable. Why we have, which has strengthened our views that their belief systems were inferior to ours. But as we now approach this with curious minds and scientific mindsets, like yourself here, and quite a few others actually, it turns out that what we find is basically what the ancients were talking about. Do you think that we have reached in our evolution here on Earth, humankind, a matureness today that makes it possible for us to embrace this deep knowledge, and this time to our benefit, perhaps?
So what I always say,
there's
nothing new in this time. What we are reinventing all knowledge and all wisdom. And that has been set down in the Vedas and the Upanishads. It has been set down in Tibetan Buddhism. It has been set down in the Kabbalah. It has been said in Gnostic Christianity. It has been said by Plato, who writes about a classical near-death experience where the soul is earth, but also writes that the soul is eternal and is just, the soul is experienced in a body which disappears as well. So it's a temporary body with an eternal soul. That's what Plato says. So it has been known always, and we have forgotten it since the last 3-4 centuries as well, because of the what we call science has changed, but it has changed into a materialistic approach, a materialistic paradigm. So we have forgotten the real insight and wisdom of all the knowledge. And I think also the indigenous people in the United States, but also Aboriginals in Africa, have known always this kind of generation where they have been in contact with the older families, older members of the families as well, when they have died. So it's not new at all, but we have the huge prejudice because of our modern materialist approach to science, that we are not open to this kind of knowledge, that we are changing. And I personally believe that all these kind of experiences that have been there for ages and ages and ages, in all times and all religions, are the basis for what we call now religion. It's a reinventing of old wisdom.
Maybe the problem with religion has been that it has been fairly materialistic, actually.
Oh yes,
because there's been a separation between God and man. You have to do something here on earth in order to enter heaven. And so
I'm not talking about church. I'm talking about religion, which is
yes, that's
and people with an NDE, they always tell me, I don't believe anymore.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
They know how it is. They know that there is no end of there's a continuity of consciousness. Death is not death, but another form of life.
Yeah. You mentioned Plato. He had this wonderful concept of, I don't know what the term is in English, but the realm of ideas, or the world of ideas.
Yes. Yeah.
There's I mean, we have things here on earth, but there is, in that other realm, there is the perfect expression of that idea, which is actually what we have in our heads when we want to create something. We think about something, and inventors, they suddenly get an epiphany, an idea. I want to create that, and then they do it, and then they have the physical result, which is probably a bit sub-optimizing of the the first idea, because the idea is perfect.
The Bible starts with the word logos. Logos, idea is word, so it starts with the words. It starts with the ideas.
Yes, in the beginning was the word.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I can't think of a field of research that would be more important than trying to find out what we all are and why we exist. So I can't understand the skeptics' view on this. They find
that's what I told you before. They're frightened. They're frightened to lose the research, when they're frightened to lose their worldview. And I can understand it. I can understand. I don't understand the aggressive way they attack me, like what you said. The skeptics changed my Wikipedia. They publish skeptic articles about me or about Eben Alexander and other people who doing studies on near-death experiences. But I understand they're frightened, and I always tell people that I know a painter here in Holland who has said that I always listen with a lot of interest to all the critics to my work. So I learn how people think. So it's always about the others. It's not about my work, but it's about how other people think.
Okay.
But that's what about this. We learn about the skeptics, how they think. It's not about my work.
No, that's very wise to see it that way, because it's not. You shouldn't take it personally. If you take everything personal, you will just perish. It's not possible.
It has been sometimes a little bit difficult, but now I've learned.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. You're a wise man.
Now I send them some love when they attack me.
Okay, good. So what do you think the implications would be if, for science and medicine, if it were to become commonplace and mainstream, to accept that consciousness is non-local and both precedes and continues beyond the physical body? What would the implications?
We talk about healthcare. How do we treat patients in coma? How do we treat terminal patients? How we talk about life and death? How we accept end-of-life experiences? How do we accept after-death communication? In Europe, about 120 million people must have had communication with the conscious of deceased relatives, but they don't talk about it because it's not accepted at all. And it changed your insight about life and death. And the way we think about death changes the way we live our life. And so also about organ transplantation. When someone is declared brain death, which is the start of the process of dying, and they take out organs from a body with a beating heart, what happens to consciousness at that very moment? So we have a lot of aspects you can discuss. And then the other thing is, how do we treat our planet Earth, our endangered planet Earth? How do we use our food? Why do still people eat meat? It takes so much water and land to have meat. So we have to change the way we live. We have to change the way what we eat. We have to change how we treat others as well. So it has a huge impact in our society as well, and it changes a bit. But it is slow change, but I'm very positive. I think it will change. And
Good.
what I know from the younger generation when I lecture to medical students, they are much more open than the older generation, like my generation.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we would have less pills prescribed and less incidences of depression and all those kinds of things.
But it takes time.
How has this research affected your own view on life? Has it diminished your own fear of death, for instance? Maybe you weren't afraid of death when you were younger.
My idea was always that death is the end of who we are, until I started to study and to talk with patients with a near-death experience. And I've talked to hundreds or perhaps thousands of patients, and I've received thousands and thousands of emails from all over the world to people who share their ND with me. So now, I don't think I'm really afraid of death. I'm now curious what happens when I die. And I think it changed the way I live as well. So I'm more conscious about nature. We always at least 1 hour in nature walking there or walking. And I love silence. We have organic food, what we eat. Logic organic, like anthroposophy. So we try to live a little bit more consciously than we did in the past. And my wife helps me as well in the same way.
Yeah, well, it is easier to live in the moment when you're not afraid of death, I guess.
No. It's all about the moment.
Key to happiness, I think.
Exactly.
So finally, I just want to ask about the times that we live in now. We have this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has raised a lot of questions about how we react to things, to big things, life and death and all that. You know, many countries have had these lockdowns. I know there was a big debate in your country, the Netherlands, about the lockdowns there. There was even a court case. In Sweden, we haven't had a complete lockdown, but it's been restricted enough in many respects. So when you hear the politicians and the media talk about what we are doing here, they're talking about saving lives. But that's kind of interesting because you can't, I mean, this is a paradox because we have been talking about our lives as probably being at the core eternal, but our physical bodies, our physical lives are obviously not eternal. I mean, we are going to die. And when you listen to the debate around this pandemic, you get the impression that these politicians and these media persons, they kind of convey the notion that if we didn't have this pandemic, nobody would die. We would be immortal. So we saved life. We had to save life. Do you understand what I'm talking about? I think this is a bit problematic. Does this say something about how detached we have become from life and death and all this?
One of the main things is what we discussed as well. So death is the end of our physical body, but not the end of our consciousness. But I think the discussion about the pandemic is now that the problem with the healthcare. So a lot of people are severely ill, and there are not enough beds on the intensive care units to help all those patients. And people still believe that while I'm ill, I'm going to hospital, I will be safe. And that's not true. So also the normal health care has stopped or has been diminished because of all the very ill patients with COVID. So the problem is the capacity for hospitals to give care to patients. It's not just about death. And the other thing is that we should think about how we lived until now. We travel around the world. We fly 4 times a year with all those holidays, etc. We eat meat. We don't think about death, and we just love to live our lives as we want to. And I think we are confronted with the fact that not everything is possible. And not also in healthcare, and not everything is possible. It's not just about fear of death. It's just we have to change the way we live. And perhaps the pandemic helps us to think it over as well.
Yeah. Hopefully, we will change our ways.
Yes.
Excellent. It's a nice way to end this discussion. Thank you, Pim van Lommel. It's been incredibly enlightening and fascinating to hear your insights and your explanations and thoughts. So I hope your findings will continue to enlighten people about the most important issue of all.
Shall I show my book again?
Consciousness Beyond Life.
Yeah, that's it.
Excellent.
And they can also come to my website. www.consciousnessbeyondlife.com, and they can find articles, interviews, lectures, etc.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you again for being a guest on Mind the Shift.
You're
Pim van
welcome.
Lommel.